Special thanks to Horizon Therapeutics for sponsoring the Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast, working tirelessly to research, develop, and bring forward medicines for people living with rare and rheumatic diseases. Discover more about Horizon Therapeutics' mission at horizontherapeutics.com.
Everything that you could have hoped and dreamed for, or you had been hoping and dreaming for Edith was changed in an instant. It wasn't a slow burn. It wasn't a coming to terms. It was as soon as you got the diagnosis, and we can come to sort of what we immediately did thereafter, but it was very quick that Edith, the life that we expected for Edith was not going to be the life that Edith had or will have. Now, that doesn't mean the life that she will have won't be fantastic, won't be full of love and joy, but it's different.
That's our guest this week, Tim Coughlin, the head of the Commodity and Infrastructure Finance Group at Morgan Stanley in London, England. Tim is the father of two young daughters, one of whom, Edith, age 2, was diagnosed with BBSOAS, a very rare neurological disorder. We'll hear all about Tim and how he and his wife Jennifer have dealt with the news of this diagnosis on this Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast. Now say hello to the founder of the Special Fathers Network and the host of the Dad to Dad podcast, David Hirsch.
Hi, and thanks for listening to the Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast, presented by the Special Fathers Network, a Dad to Dad mentoring program for fathers raising children with special needs. The Special Fathers Network Mastermind Group Experience is the most comprehensive program the 21st Century Dads Foundation offers. Dads raising children with special needs meet virtually on a weekly basis and form meaningful relationships while sharing weekly wins, discussing books, and sharing heartfelt challenges. One of the highlights of the year is attending an in-person weekend retreat. We're launching 10 new SFN mastermind groups in January 2024 with 10 dads per group. That means we're only looking for 10 like-minded dads in each of the following locations: Anchorage, Alaska, Bellevue, Nebraska, Chicago, Illinois, Denver, Colorado, Georgetown, Grand Cayman, Houston, Texas, Indianapolis, Indiana, London, England, Nashville, Tennessee, and Reykjavik, Iceland. If you're a dad raising a child with special needs in one of these cities, we hope you'll join the local SFN Mastermind Group and make the investment to become the best version of yourself. For more information, please see the show notes or simply go to 21stcenturydads.org.
Now let's hear this conversation between Special Father Tim Coughlin and David Hirsch.
I'm thrilled to be talking today with Tim Coughlin, a U.S. expat originally from Basking Ridge, New Jersey, now living and working in London, where he's the head of the Commodity and Infrastructure Finance Group for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa at Morgan Stanley, and the father of two young daughters. Tim, thank you for taking the time to do a podcast interview for the Special Fathers Network.
Thank you, David. Really looking forward to it.
You and your wife, Jennifer, have been married for 8 years and are the proud parents of two young girls, Alice, 4, and Edith, 2, who was diagnosed with BBSOAS, or Bosch-Boonstra-Schaff Optic Atrophy syndrome, a very rare neurological disorder caused by this disruption in the NR2F1 gene. Let's start with some background. Where did you grow up? Tell me something about your family.
I grew up in Basking Ridge, New Jersey, which is, you consider, a suburb of New York City, a far-out suburb, but a suburb of New York City. I was the oldest of 4, with 2 loving parents who were very focused on doing everything they could for us.
So it was a beaver cleaver type of deal?
A little bit. I cringe to describe it that way, but with the gift of hindsight, you don't realize how sort of lucky I was to have a family that stuck together, parents who provided us what I thought was a very boring childhood growing up in the suburbs, but was actually pretty idyllic and quite blissful, and we're incredibly lucky and privileged to grow up where we were with the family we had and had the time together that we did.
Thanks for that reflection. And are your siblings there in New Jersey, or?
Yes, 2 of them are in New Jersey, happily married, and one who is still holding on to New York City, but she's on the west side, so I'll say she's as close to Jersey as you can get and still be in Manhattan.
So you're the black sheep, the one over there in Europe.
I'm a little bit further afield than my siblings, yes, that is safe to say.
Out of curiosity, what did your dad do for a living?
He was a lawyer in private practice. He still is. He's still active. He worked in law firms in New Jersey, but had a career that was very interesting and influenced me a great deal. It was global in nature, and so he traveled a lot, and I was always attracted to that. I can blame him for ending up where I am, but he always ensured that his commute, it was never too far away. I know, one, he probably wouldn't have wanted to commute all the way to New York City, but two, it was really important to spend time with family. It was telling how much he organized both his personal and professional life around that.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a great role model in a lot of different ways. So when you think about your relationship with your dad, how would you describe that?
I'd say it's a very strong relationship. And again, I go back to what I said a few minutes ago, where only in hindsight do you realize how lucky you are. He's a very strong, caring man, and he's always put his family first. He really and truly did, and he's a tremendous role model, and it's very, very hard to conceive how I could live up to him and what he did for us.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you have a lot of admiration for your dad, and maybe the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree, certainly from an occupation standpoint. So were there any important takeaways, something you've tried to incorporate into your own fathering that come to mind?
My dad was always focused on being present and being available. He spent every weekend with his family. Every night he'd come home or dinner, and we'd have a sit-down family dinner, which, growing up in America in the 80s and 90s, I didn't realize was strange or unique. And I'm not saying that we were the only household, but it did. As we got older, we realized that stood out. He always prioritized that, or he prioritized it as much as he could. And that's something that will always stick in my mind. And even to this day, if I encounter sort of friends from that period of my life, there's folks who have commented on it. They remember that and how unique it was. It's things like that that really kind of stuck out, how much he prioritized and orchestrated his being around our family.
Yeah, well, that having dinner or trying to have dinner every night with your family is critically important, right, when you look back on it. But you might have just taken it for granted, right, just based on, that was just your own experience or your reality growing up. So I'm hoping that maybe that's one of the things that you try to bake into your own parenting or fathering experience as well. And my recollection was that you took a degree in history from Trinity College. From there you went to law school. Did you always have an ambition to go to law school?
I think, to make this as cliche as possible, I wanted to do what my dad did. He had a really interesting career, and growing up kind of in the way that I grew up, that was and still is kind of the be-all end-all, is to be your dad. And he was a lawyer, so I thought that was the natural progression. I toyed around with maybe doing something else. It was just kind of as early as I can remember, it was, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a lawyer. My dad's a lawyer. So yeah, I went to law school for probably no more sophisticated reason than that's what I always thought I should do.
How'd you choose Villanova?
My grades were not as good as they should have been, one. But two, I think most importantly, again, going back to kind of wanting to be your dad, my mom and dad actually went to Villanova and they met there. So, and it was close enough to home. It wasn't too far afield, and it was a fantastic law school. Ended up being a very good 3 years for me.
Excellent. So I'm sort of curious to know, how did you and Jennifer meet?
We met on a blind date. In New York City. We were set up, and we were set up for drinks, had drinks, probably a few too many, and ended up being a great night. It was the last first date I've ever been on. And
there was something around that dinner experience afterwards. I can't remember the details, but it was like some crazy story.
It was sure a lot of men can relate to this. We went to a restaurant, and this is in the East Village of New York City. We went to a restaurant, and someone at the table next to us, a gentleman, had collapsed, like immediately, just fallen over. And his wife, girlfriend, partner, whoever she was very distressed and distraught. And in a moment of absolute sobriety and clarity, which I thought had long escaped me, I checked his pulse. He had a pulse. He wasn't breathing. So I did the Heimlich maneuver. Turns out he was choking. But the reason I say it was the last first date I've ever been on is my wife now actually thought she was on some candid camera show because the restaurant is clapping, people are sending champagne, and everyone's like, how long have you been together? And she's like, this is the first time I've met this person. And so I knew right then and there, I'm never, ever going to look better than this. So I may as well just call it. And that's it. And here we are, 2 kids later.
I love that story. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
So where is Jennifer from?
She's from Somerset County in England, which you could think of on a map kind of due west of London.
Okay. So let's talk about special needs first on a personal level and then beyond. So prior to Edith's diagnosis, did you or Jennifer have any connection to the world of disability or special needs?
We did not.
And what is Edith's diagnosis and how did it come about?
So Edith was diagnosed with something is a very, very long, convoluted name, which you did an excellent job pronouncing, which we just refer to as BBSOAS. And what that is a mutation, but it's a variant in a particular gene called the NR2F1 gene. There can be different types of mutations within that gene, or that gene can be deleted in its entirety, and all have kind of similar-ish, albeit varying in severity, end results, and together, those are categorized as BBSOAS.
So at what age was this diagnosed, or how did you sort of learn about it, or how was the testing done?
We had an experience very similar to, I know a number of other parents who have, I would call it an ultra rare. We had, the benefit of having Alice, who's 2 years older. So we had a reference point for kind of what are milestones, what's supposed to be like. And we mainly, my wife knew from 6 weeks on that something was amiss. And we were slightly attuned, or I would say hypersensitive, because really even during the pregnancy, we had were given call it a scare. Originally, we were told that there was a heightened risk of Down syndrome. And then we did all this subsequent testing, and they actually ruled that out. But we were still hyper aware. And she had a difficult delivery. So antennae were up. But from 6 weeks, my wife knew that things were amiss. At first, it was, can Edith see? Is she blind? And then it was, well, we think she can kind of see. Can she hear? Ran tests, and she could kind of hear. But she had very low muscle tone. She had strange posture. She wouldn't eat, and she was always underweight. And so there was a confluence of things, and we went and saw a pediatric neurologist in London, and it was someone who had never encountered BBSOAS before, but she kind of heard us as parents, and she was willing to engage with us. And so we actually sort of our own volition decided to do something called whole exome sequencing, which is in the US is becoming more common. Outside the US is still exceptionally rare, and usually you have to pay for it out of pocket, which we did. And so on March 30th, 2022, we had an appointment and we got the diagnosis of BBSOAS.
Wow. Well, it seems like you short-circuited that process, if I can say it that way.
Yeah.
And I imagine now with a little bit of hindsight, that's a blessing, right, to know what it is. Absolutely
a blessing. It was there's no right way to do this or wrong way to do this if you are sort of a special needs parent. And I'd like to say I'm not sort of, whatever I say, or that this is just what we chose, not what sort of I would recommend other people chose. I can only sort of speak to our thought process. But knowledge is power. It creates a roadmap. My wife and I are, I would say, rather proactive, you could say type A people. We want to have an objective, formulate a plan, and do everything that we can. Without a diagnosis, not only, and it works differently in the UK versus the US, but in either place, without a diagnosis, you are a little bit lost in terms of, okay, maybe you can tap into certain resources, but not others. Are things covered by insurance? Are they not? But I think most importantly is trying to just get information to figure out, has someone done this before? And if they have done it before, what did they do? What worked? What didn't work? And how can I apply this to help my kid? And so we short-circuited that, as you said, and it was the hardest thing that I've ever been through, getting that information so quickly. Because in an instant, everything that you could have hoped and dreamed for, or you had been hoping and dreaming for Edith was changed in an instant. It wasn't a slow burn. It wasn't a coming to terms. It was as soon as you got the diagnosis, and we can come to sort of what we immediately did thereafter, but it was very quick that Edith, the life that we expected for Edith was not going to be the life that Edith had or will have. Now, that doesn't mean the life that she will have won't be fantastic, won't be full of love and joy, but it's different. And having that come so early on in her life, I mean, she just turned 1. That was a very painful experience for us. But what it did do is it kickstarted us on the journey we're on in terms of therapies, in terms of, research, in terms of being very active with, the small, tiny but mighty community that we have to do everything in our power to, try and influence the outcome.
So how prevalent is this BBSOAS?
That's an excellent question, and one we don't have the answer to yet. So BBSOAS was only, I'll speak in generalities because I'm sure I'll be corrected on all these dates, but really it was first discovered, I think, in 2009 or 2010. It was first published in literature in 2011. And importantly, the whole exome sequencing, which is really the only way to definitively capture kind of all the mutations or variations within the NR2F1 gene, really only came into prevalence around that same time. So, there's different databases, different sources, but, there's, a couple hundred. We're talking probably less than 300 diagnosed globally. However, through statistical analysis, we do know that there's a couple thousand people born every year, or should be, who do have some form of variant, and they're likely misdiagnosed. And I've listened to other podcasts kind of on Special Fathers Network and on the Dad to Dad series, where there's a lot of focus on trying to identify your group, because it's kind of step one in terms of the research path, is figuring out what the universe is, what the cohort is. We're at the very early stage of that, which makes it can feel very isolating as a parent by being so rare and really not having another reference point. But then I think it's also challenging to, when you're thinking about, okay, how do I marshal resources here? How do I figure out, how do I drive research? How do I get someone, whether it be a pharmaceutical company or a government or a university, interested in this if it only impacts, such a small group of kids? So identifying cases it's not topic number one or not goal number one, but it is a crucial component to kind of what we're trying to do as parents and advocates.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing. It seems like a little bit of a blessing and a curse, right, to get that specific diagnosis. Like you said, it sort of snuffed out maybe the dreams or expectations you had for Edith's life, or the life anticipated, but it does allow you to chart a path that you wouldn't otherwise perhaps be on. And I'm wondering, is part of the challenge the fears that you face? What type of fears did you and Jennifer have getting this diagnosis?
Absolutely. And, we, I think, very naively, and I know a lot of other parents in the special needs community can probably relate to this, what Edith has, it's a de novo mutation. So, as far as known science, and both my wife and I have been tested, it's not inherited. There's nothing we could do. There's nothing we could have prepared for or sort of avoided to prevent it. And so, getting the diagnosis, it was a real challenge to try and wrap our head around what the future would look like. Because if you're a parent like me, and I think pretty much every parent I've ever imagined, even before your kid's born, you sketch out their life. And of course, it's not going to work out like that. But, they're never going to make any mistakes that you made, and they're going to be perfect, and everything's going to be fine. And that's kind of the ideal, that you structure a narrative around that, and the narrative for your kid's life and all your hopes. And the challenges of Edith's condition is that the variability in the outcomes can be quite large. Will Edith ever walk? Will Edith ever be potty trained? Will Edith ever talk? Will she ever live independently? For a number of BBSOAS patients, the answer is no to any of those. There are some who don't get a diagnosis until they're adults. They have challenging lives, but they're able to function and live semi and independently with care. And not having any idea as to sort of where she might fall on that, for me was incredibly, incredibly difficult to sort of wrap my head around and rationalize. And I struggle with it every day. And I will probably until the day I die, and probably thereafter. And so, thinking about, one, what does her life look like? But then two, however it turns out, my responsibility as a parent is to always provide for her, take care of her. So financially, that's sort of logistically, and then how does this impact her older sister's life? And what does that mean for her? And it's just, it all compounds on itself. And all that uncertainty, as a parent and just innately as a human, I don't deal well with uncertainty. I want an action plan to tackle, and just having to sit with that uncertainty and sit with that unknown is a daily struggle.
Yeah, well, thanks for being so open and transparent about that. We were talking about fears, and I think that the fear of the unknown is what I heard you talking about, and coming to grips with that and sort of managing the day-to-day that goes along with that. I think that's pretty consequential. And I'm hoping that as the days, weeks, months, maybe years go by, even though there won't be a higher level, much higher level of certainty, that you'll get more accustomed to dealing with the concept of uncertainty, right? Maybe that's one of the lessons, one of the takeaways that you'll be able to look back on and say, yeah, I wasn't very good at dealing with uncertainty when this all transpired, but 5 years into it, 10 years into it, it's just our reality. You embrace that and you move forward, right? In whatever way you can, right? Not begrudgingly or not reluctantly, but just, hey, we need to live a full life, right? Because like you said, you're not just a father to one daughter, you're a father to two daughters, and you're a husband, right? And you need to bring your A game to your whole family in light of the challenges and the circumstances. So thank you for your openness. Was there some advice you got early on that's helped maybe put things in perspective, as harsh as the reality of getting the diagnosis has been?
Advice. I may pull a politician and answer the different question, but gets to the same point. When we first got the diagnosis, for a period of about 3 months, I didn't know what to do. I didn't really tell anyone. I didn't know how to react. I didn't know how to process any information or any of this reality. And we kept it clutched tightly to our chest. And we were very protective of Edith. We were very protective of our family, which was a natural reaction. But it's one that I think was unsustainable. You call it advice, but it was sort of, I had a friend, Edith's godfather, actually, one of my college roommates, a gentleman named Chris Shostak, who's one of your neighbors in Chicago. So I reached out, I told him, and I told our sort of my closest friends. And what Chris did is he actually asked if he could run the Chicago Marathon and raise funds for the NR2F1 Foundation, which is the nonprofit that focuses on Edith's condition. And what that did was two things. One, it's showing me sort of the positive possibilities of sharing the information. I shared it with him and look at what's come of it. But also then two, it gave me a reason and a means to share the information very widely, both personal and professional network. And between the time that I got Edith's diagnosis, I think I aged 15 years in an instant, in a second. If you looked at me, you could see it on me, and I could feel it. And then what I learned was, as part of the marathon that Chris wanted to do, the fundraiser, I said I'd do it with him. Now, in full disclosure, this is like the 5th or 6th time that we've done this together. But I said I'd do it with him, and so we were sharing the news and communicating. And what was amazing is that the outpouring of support that I got was astounding, both from people who have never lived or experienced anything like this, but I think surprisingly the number of people who, of course, don't have someone with BBSOAS in their life, but are somehow connected to special needs, or have someone who they care about who is impacted by special needs. And then, but for me personally, it probably, of the 15 years I lost or aged, I probably got back 7 of them. And being open and just confronting it and being present with it and being public about it. It doesn't define me. It doesn't define our family. It's there. It's a feature of our lives, but that's not us. And having it be, instead of the secret tightly held in my chest, just another very important, but just another part of our lives, was the most valuable sort of lesson I learned. So whether or not it was Chris's intention, I thank Chris for that bit of advice and really the gift of being open about it all.
Yeah, very powerful. Thanks for sharing. When you were describing how tightly you held that information and, were sort of closed-lipped about it, I almost thought it was like a form of denial.
100%. 100%.
Yeah. And you come to grips with it, and, thank God for people like Chris that, were like, hey, let's do this, right? And it gives there's a crack, right? The light comes in, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, it's not the end of the world, right? Maybe I can move forward here, and one step leads to the next, and before you know it, you're running a marathon and you're talking about it, opening up, and it's like you got a new lease on life. That's how I heard you describing it.
That's exactly right. And I won't say that everyone has to sort of run a marathon. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, to be honest with you. But not being afraid of it. And just to be clear, I'm still terrified every single day of my life, and I will be. Maybe I hope someday I'm not, but it still scares the pick your four-letter word out of me. But being open about it, it was really important and really impactful. And when we first started communicating, before that, we had a script that my wife and I wrote out. We would send it to people, like we send it to a few of our neighbors, because they see Edith and they always ask, oh, is she walking? Is she talking? And the answer is like, no, shut that up. Like, stop asking. Of course not. So we would do that to kind of like protect ourselves. But now it's not as big a deal. It's not this confrontational. It doesn't own us in the same way it did.
We'll be back with more of the conversation on the Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast in just a few moments. But first, this quick message. Please help 21st century dads gather research on families raising children with special needs by having them complete the Special Fathers Network Early Intervention Parents Survey. A link to the survey can be found in the show notes. As a token of our appreciation, each person, mom or dad, who completes the survey will receive a Great Dad coin. Thank you. Now, back to the conversation.
And not to focus on the negative, but what have been some of the bigger challenges you've encountered?
I'd go back to kind of the uncertainty, and this might seem small and petty. I mean, Edith's we're very lucky in that BBSOAS is not a life-limiting disease, and I mean that in terms of on its own, it doesn't impact sort of her life expectancy or her lifespan. So we don't have some of the challenges that a lot of other special needs parents will face. But she's on some pretty powerful, complex medications that have side effects to try and help with some of her development. I mean, for us, I'd say the biggest challenge is just from a very early age, knowing and seeing our friends' kids, the neighbors' kids, all kind of progress on a more neurotypical timeline. And watching Edith, fall further and further behind. And then knowing that she will continue to do that. Like that's Edith. That's the track she's on. That's been really hard. And, her sister is 4. 4-year-olds can be pretty cool, not because they're mean. It's just hearing Alice get questions and seeing kids who don't interact with people in the special needs community ask questions about why does Edith use a walker, which is these are challenges, but what impacts sort of us as parents the most is seeing that and then trying to think about what that means for the next 30, 40, 50, 80 years, however long Edith's life may be. That's been really challenging.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing. It does take an extra level of discipline, I think, to not worry about the past or project too far out into the future. Because, if you spend too much time anticipating, what's down the road, not just 6 months down the road, but a year or 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years down the road, nobody really knows. So it's easy to talk about just to try to be focused and present with what's going on today and just celebrate that with whatever the small victories are. And it sounds trite or quaint to say it that way, but I think part of it is trying to be more present, because that's all we got is the time that we have now. You don't know what the future will hold. So along those lines, what impact has Edith's situation had on your marriage or your extended family for that matter?
On our marriage, I can't envisage any couple kind of going into marriage being like, oh yeah, we'll totally handle that fine. Like, yeah, bring it on. And I remember a time shortly before Edith's diagnosis where, my wife had been banging the drum. Something's really wrong. Something is really, truly wrong. And I was holding on, denying. She took me out to dinner, which as parents of 2 young kids didn't happen very often. Even just to get out for like a couple hours. And she kind of like, metaphorically, maybe even literally if I think back hard enough, kind of took me by the lapels and shook me and was like, you need to acknowledge this. Like, this is happening. And I didn't, or not to the same degree that she did until the diagnosis came, but it forced us to kind of, come together as a couple. And it is hard. It is really, really hard. And we're still pretty new at this. I mean, you've had the privilege of having, a lot of people on the show who have way more experience to deal with this way better than we have. But we're at the start of the journey. And it took us a while to kind of shake the cobwebs off and kind of come together on it. But we've pulled together as a team. We made the decision, and we were kind of looking at each other. It's like, okay, what's the most important thing right now? It's Edith and her care. And, Edith's in pretty intense therapy. She trains just like a professional athlete, at least 90 minutes of one-on-one, whether it's occupational, visual, speech, physical, or a combined multidisciplinary therapy every day. And so, we kind of ran some numbers and did the math. It took us a couple months to get there, but I think we pretty quickly pulled together and just said, we got to roll our sleeves up and do everything that we can. So that was a very long-winded answer to how did it impact my marriage. I would say definitely a net positive. I wish we didn't have to go through it that way, and I don't wish any parent, but it's strengthened our bond as a married couple pretty dramatically.
Yeah, well, thank you for being so open and honest about that. The image that you created in my mind about going to dinner and Jennifer metaphorically taking you by the lapels and sort of shaking you, what came to mind was, I would always say, with whatever the situation was, why don't we cross that bridge when we get to it?
Oh,
right?
100%. Were you hiding under the table, David? Because that sounds exactly like what I said.
Yeah, and I would add, in addition to let's cross that bridge when we get to it, is let's not pre-worry our worries, right? Let's not get ahead of ourselves. And, in many cases, that's probably healthy, but, if you've got something more consequential that you are staring in the face, like you've described, I guess at some point you just have to smell the coffee and say, hey, we need to address the situation, right? The denial or the let's take a longer term approach maybe isn't the healthy thing to do. So the heroine in the story here is obviously your wife. So thank you for sharing.
Always, every story. Yes.
So I'm thinking about supporting organizations, and I'm wondering what comes to mind as far as organizations that Edith has benefited from.
There's a few, and I'm going to selfishly say both Edith and our family. The first one is the NR2F1 Foundation itself, which when we walked to the Cromwell Hospital, we were like, what is this? And Google it, and this website comes up. And what it is when you first encounter it, you think this is this massive group of families, professionally run, beautiful website, all the information is in one place, terrifying information. But it's all there. There's sort of a support network on a Facebook group. And so we had that at our fingertips, and that was incredibly powerful. We also happened to, through sheer luck, and it was luck. The foundation was founded a couple of years ago, but kind of pre-COVID, they had their first conference. And then in 2022 was their second conference, which was an in-person conference I think in Florida. But they had an online sort of you could register and watch online. And it was the next week. We got diagnosed on like a Thursday. It was the following Wednesday. And so as opposed to many, if not most families in the kind of rare genetic disease community, not only did we have a website, but then within a week we had a 10-hour live seminar with every researcher who's relevant, every doctor who's relevant, every geneticist who's relevant, telling us everything we could possibly want to know. And again, it was terrifying, but it was incredibly powerful. And we've really can't thank the foundation. It's really it's just families and individuals. So the NR2F1 Foundation is fantastic, and my wife and I are both kind of, whether they wanted us or not, we're in. So we're both on the board, and my wife is currently the vice president in other families. More locally, and I think equally impactful, another one was Combined Brain, which is I'd say is more on the scientific end of the spectrum or the research end of the spectrum. And Combined Brain has helped not only the NR2F1 Foundation, but a lot of folks in the kind of the rare disease community access cutting edge genetic researchers and neuroscientists. And they're a fantastic organization that's helped us personally in the NR2F1 Foundation immensely.
So Combined Brains, that's a U.S.-based not-for-profit.
It's a U.S.-based not-for-profit, and there's between 20 and 30 foundations which are members of Combined Brain, all with kind of ultra-rare or rare genetic mutations or sort of genetic diseases.
I think I saw something at the Combined Brain website which really caught my attention. I thought it was just like a play on words, but I think what you just emphasized, it's a reality. And one of the navigation buttons was run a neuroscientist. I'm like, run a neuroscientist? How would you run a neuroscientist?
Yep. we rent a neuroscientist. But what it is, David, and I'm sure, I hope, if anyone bothers to listen to this, I hope they do. But if you're out there as a rare disease parent, you will have to very quickly become an amateur geneticist or neuroscientist, and you will find yourself reading research papers without a translator. And that's part of the rabbit hole I went down right after I got Edith's diagnosis. Just helping organizations like ours translate things for everyday humans.
Well, thanks for sharing. We'll be sure to include some information in the show notes about Combined Brains. And was there another organization?
There was one, in pivoting to sort of what's impactful for us personally, fantastic organization called Small Steps, which is a UK-based charity that provides early intervention, and I describe it as multidisciplinary therapy for children with severe physical and or mental special needs. And the way that you graduate out of the program is you learn to walk independently, or you go into school full time, and everything is centered around that. And that's for the kids, and that is fantastic. But what's been most, I think, impactful for us as a family is the equal weight that the organization gives to providing support for the parents and the rest of the families to come to terms with being, a special needs parent, and also creating a community around it, because being a special needs parent can be an incredibly isolating experience. But knowing you're not alone and having people to interact with and share experiences with and sort of, talk to, cry to, have a beer with, get together, not talk about your kids at all, but know that it's there and it's not hanging out there, has been fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. And it's an organization that I really can't sing the praises of highly enough. I know it's very UK specific. A lot of the listeners are in other parts of the world, but it's the type of local organization that really, no matter where you are, if you have something like that, if you're a special needs parent, don't be afraid of grasping it with both hands. Finding your community is huge. It's like the biggest thing.
Well, thanks for sharing. Small Steps sounds like an extraordinary organization, primarily focused on early intervention age kids. I think of that as 0 to 3, but like you said, it's not age specific, it is ability specific as far as the groupings and the therapy. And I love the fact that you graduate or you move on from the small steps organization, once you've reached a milestone, right? Either you're walking or you're ambulatory or, you're in an educational environment where you can take the next steps. So thank you. So I'm sort of curious to know what role spirituality has played in your lives.
So spirituality plays a big role in my life. I was born and raised Catholic, predisposed Catholic, Irish Catholic. And going back to my parents, my dad in particular, and going back to my grandfather, my grandfather went to Mass every single day till the day he died. And, growing up, we would always, every Sunday we're in church. Every Sunday. It was non-negotiable. And whether there was spirituality there or not, we were going. And as in full disclosure, it's, for many years it was sheer habit. So, and we've kind of gone to church, and where we live in London, there's a very active Catholic church right around the corner. They have a Catholic school, which when we moved here, we said, oh, that's a nice bonus. Little did we know it's like one of the few and most active parishes in all of London. And I don't know if this is where you were going, but I think it's worth saying, the sort of priest who's head of our parish, he was one of the first people I told about Edith. And he gave some really, really good advice. When I told him, he sort of asked me where was I with all of this? And he gave me permission to be angry. And he said, that's okay. You can be angry. It's your kid. And what that did is that enabled, I interpreted that as giving me an excuse or sort of an okay to grapple with a lot of this stuff. And, my spiritual journey is my own, but it's something that I definitely think having the upbringing I did in the Catholic Church has armed me to weather this better than if I didn't have it.
Yeah, well, thank you for your transparency. I'm thinking about advice now, and you've obviously offered a lot of advice, but if you were to sort of summarize or encapsulate, what advice would you have for parents, or specifically a dad who finds himself maybe toward the beginning of one of these challenging situations with a diagnosis? It doesn't necessarily have to be a rare disease. What advice would you have for him?
Find other astronauts. I'll give this example. David, the way you and I are introduced is, I was listening to a podcast. I had never reached out and I never did anything, but I had found the, Special Fathers Network and the Dad to Dad podcast series. And I was just listening to one by Ian Todd. Everyone should listen to Ian. He's a great guy. Had a lot of wise things to say, but what he said resonated with me, and I reached out. And, he and I become especially close. He lives in Baltimore, Maryland. I live in England, and we talk or text every week. And what it is, and he said it, and others have said it as well, but as a newly diagnosed father, what you're going through, no one, or at least I thought, no one could possibly understand what I'm going through. And I equated it to being, it's like being an astronaut. There's X 100,000 licensed pilots in the world, anyone who can fly a plane. Then, okay, how many of those can be commercial pilots, can fly an airplane with you and me passengers? How many of those are fighter pilots, which is a smaller subset? How many of those fighter pilots are qualified astronauts? How many of those qualified astronauts have ever been to space? Then however many of them have done a moonwalk or sort of, or walked in space? And it gets more and more narrow very, very, very quickly. And you can feel more and more alone. And reaching out to other astronauts is how you realize you're not so alone, even if your circumstances are unique, and it's not to trivialize them in any way, shape, or form, but you'll find strength in talking to others and much to be gained and very, very little, if anything, to lose. Because I think you'll find people are empathetic. They want to help. They want to help you help your kid. Whether it's organizations like Small Steps or just another guy on the other side of the world who's going through it, you'll find, I think, people ready, willing, and able to reach out. So don't hold on too tight to it.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing. I love that astronaut metaphor, and finding your community, finding some strength, from these other individuals. It's very powerful. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up?
I think I have to give a plug for Special Fathers Network, the Dad to Dad podcast. I mean, to bring it full circle, the way I found the Dad to Dad podcast was through Combined Brain. because Combined Brain, one of the member organizations from Combined Brain, is something called the SYNGAP Research Fund, which is founded by a gentleman named Mike Grockley. And Mike did a podcast and he put it on his website. Lo and behold, that's how I found it. I listened to his, and then I started scrolling through and listening, further and further. And the work that folks do is really impactful and really empowering. So thank you for it, and know that, even if it's not immediately apparent, it really reaches out and touches people's lives. So really just end on that. Thank you, David, and to the whole team.
Yeah, well, thanks for the plug. We know that people listen to the podcast. Some of them self-identify and they get engaged in one way or another, attend the conference, attend one of the meetups, get involved with one of the mastermind groups. But, oftentimes, maybe it's just all that somebody needs is a periodic reminder that they're not alone, inspirational story or insight every once in a while that helps them, put their own situation in perspective. So I appreciate you mentioning that. So let's give a formal special shout out to Ian Todd of Baltimore, Maryland, SFN Podcast Dad number 238, and a member of the Special Fathers Network Mastermind Group for helping connect us.
Of course.
If somebody wants to learn more about BBSOAS, the NR2F1 Foundation, or to contact you, what's the best way to do that?
They can reach out to me on LinkedIn, or they can email me at trcoughlin@gmail.com. And please, no one should ever hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to talk day, night, really about anything.
Excellent. Appreciate that. We'll include all that information in the show notes, so it'll make it as easy as possible for somebody to reach out. Tim, thank you for your time and many insights. As a reminder, Tim is just one of the dads who's part of the Special Fathers Network, a mentoring program for fathers raising a child with special needs. If you'd like to be a mentor father or are seeking advice from a mentor father with a similar situation to your own, please go to 21stcenturydads.org. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of the Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. As you probably know, the 21st Century Dads Foundation is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization, which means we need your help to keep our content free to all concerned. Would you please consider making a tax-deductible contribution? I would really appreciate your support. Tim, thanks again.
Of course.
And thank you for listening to the Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast. The Special Fathers Network is a dad-to-dad mentoring program for fathers raising children with special needs. Through our personalized matching process, new fathers with special needs children match up with mentor fathers in a similar situation. It's a great way for dads to support other dads. To find out more, go to 21stcenturydads.org.
And if you're a dad looking for help or would like to offer help, we would be honored to have you join our closed Facebook group. Please go to facebook.com/groups and search Dad to Dad. Lastly, we're always looking to share interesting stories. If you'd like to share your story or know of a compelling story, please send an email to david@21stcenturydads.org.
The Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast was produced by me, Tom Couch. Thanks again to Horizon Therapeutics, who believe that science and compassion must work together to transform lives. That's why they work tirelessly to research, develop, and bring forward medicines for people living with rare and rheumatic diseases. Discover more about Horizon Therapeutics at horizontherapeutics.com.